The forest was alive with whispers, not the kind carried on the wind or rustling through the leaves, but the kind that lingered in the hearts of the people, whispers of despair, of anger, of a longing for something they could not name. Sherwood. Forest stretched vast and ancient, its canopy a shield against the sun, its shadows a refuge for those who had nowhere else to go. But even here, in the heart of the wild, the weight of oppression pressed down like a stone. Marian of Locksley stood at the edge of the forest, her cloak pulled tight against the chill of the evening. She was not supposed to be here. A noblewoman of her standing had no business wandering the woods alone, especially not with the sheriff's men patrolling the roads. But Marian had never been one to follow rules, not when they chafed against her sense of justice. She had heard the stories, of course, everyone had, tales of a man who would rise from the shadows to challenge the tyranny of Prince John and his lackeys, a man who would steal from the rich to feed the poor, who would fight for the downtrodden and become a symbol of hope. But that man had never come. The legend of Robin Hood remained just that, a legend, and in his absence, the people suffered. Marian's fingers brushed against the hilt of the dagger hidden beneath her cloak. It was a small comfort, but a necessary one. The roads were dangerous, and the forest was no safer. She had come here seeking answers, though she wasn't entirely sure what questions she was asking. All she knew was that she could no longer stand by and watch as the Sheriff of Nottingham tightened his grip on the people, as families were torn apart by taxes they could not pay, as hope withered like a dying flame. The ruins of the old Saxon shrine lay hidden deep within the forest, a relic of a time before the Normans, before the crown's heavy hand had reached into every corner of England. Marian had heard whispers of it from an old traveller, a man who spoke of ancient magic and forgotten heroes. She hadn't believed him, not really, but something in his words had stirred a spark within her. And so she had come, driven by a curiosity she could not explain. The shrine was little more than a pile of moss-covered stones now, half buried by the roots of the trees that had grown around it. But as Marian approached, she felt a strange energy in the air, a hum that seemed to resonate in her bones. She knelt beside the stones, her fingers tracing the carvings that had been worn smooth by time. They depicted a man with a bow, his arrow aimed at the sky, surrounded by figures who seemed to be reaching out to him in supplication. At the center of the shrine, partially obscured by dirt and leaves, was an arrow. It was unlike any Marian had ever seen. Its shaft was dark and polished, its fletching made of feathers that shimmered with an otherworldly light. She reached for it hesitantly, half expecting it to vanish like a mirage, but it was real, solid, and cool to the touch. As her fingers closed around the arrow, a jolt of energy shot through her, sharp and electric. She gasped, nearly dropping it, but the sensation was gone as quickly as it had come. In its place was a warmth that spread through her chest, a feeling of resolve that she had not felt in years. "What are you?" she whispered, turning the arrow over in her hands. The answer came not in words but in images that flashed through her mind like fragments of a dream. She saw a man standing atop a hill, his bow drawn, an arrow flying true. She saw crowds of people, their faces alight with hope, rallying behind him. And then she saw the man fall, betrayed, his legacy fading into obscurity. Marian's breath caught in her throat. She knew, without knowing how, that this arrow had belonged to him, to Edric the Wild, the rebel who had defied the Norman conquest. It was more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a beacon for those who dared to fight against tyranny. But there was something else, something darker. The arrow was not just a tool of rebellion, it was a test. It demanded a sacrifice, a price that Marian could not yet comprehend. She felt it in the weight of the arrow, in the way it seemed to pulse in her hands as if it were alive. A twig snapped behind her, and Marian spun around, her heart pounding. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, his silhouette framed by the fading light. He was tall and lean, with a sword at his side and a wary expression on his face. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and rough. Marian straightened, clutching the arrow to her chest. "Neither should you." The man stepped closer, and she could see the weariness in his eyes, the scars that marked his face. He looked like a man who had seen too much, who had fought too many battles and lost too many friends. "Name's Will," he said after a moment. "Will Scarlet. And if you've got any sense, you'll leave that thing where you found it." Marion's grip tightened on the arrow. "Why?" Will's gaze flicked to the shrine, then back to her. "Because nothing good comes from digging up the past. Trust me." But Marion didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone, not anymore. And as she looked down at the arrow in her hands, she felt a spark of defiance ignite within her. "Maybe the past is exactly what we need," she said quietly. Will studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "So you're going to get yourself killed?" "Maybe," Marion replied, "but if I do, at least I'll die fighting for something." Will shook his head, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or maybe just resignation. "You're either very brave or very foolish." "Both," Marion said with a faint smile. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the two of them stood there, the weight of the arrow between them. Marion didn't know what she was getting herself into, but she knew one thing for certain. The world was about to change, and she would be the one to change it. The forest was no longer a refuge. It was a battlefield. Marion moved through the trees with the arrow of Edric clutched tightly in her hand, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Behind her, the shouts of the sheriff's men echoed through the woods, their torches casting flickering shadows that danced like specters among the trees. She had been careless. She had lingered too long at the shrine, and now they were closing in. Will Scarlet moved silently beside her, his sword drawn, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. He had insisted on coming with her, though his reasons were unclear. Perhaps he felt some sense of obligation, or perhaps he simply didn't trust her to survive on her own. Whatever the case, Marion was grateful for his presence. "This way," Will whispered, gesturing toward a narrow path that wound through the underbrush. "There's a cave not far from here. We can lose them there." Marion nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the arrow in her hand, its presence both comforting and unnerving. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it were urging her forward, guiding her steps. The cave was small and hidden, its entrance obscured by a tangle of vines and roots. Will pushed aside the foliage and motioned for Marion to enter, then followed close behind. The air inside was cool and damp, the walls slick with moisture. Marion leaned against the stone, her legs trembling with exhaustion. "We can't stay here long," Will said, his voice low. "They'll find us eventually." Marion nodded, her mind racing. She had known the risks when she took the arrow, but she hadn't expected the sheriff's men to find her so quickly. It was as if they had been waiting for her, as if they had known what she was searching for. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Will hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "You're the one with the magic arrow, you tell me." Marion looked down at the arrow, its dark shaft gleaming faintly in the dim light. She had felt its power when she first touched it, a surge of energy that had filled her with resolve. But now, as she held it in her hands, she felt something else, a sense of unease, as if the arrow were watching her, waiting for her to make a choice. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I can't let them take it, not after everything I've seen." Will's expression softened, and for a moment he looked almost sympathetic. "You're in over your head, Marion. This isn't some noble woman's adventure. This is real. People die in real fights." Marion met his gaze, her jaw tightening. "I know that. But if I don't do something, more people will die. The sheriff will keep taking everything from them until there's nothing left. I can't just stand by and let that happen." Will sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You sound like someone I used to know." Marion frowned. "Who?" Will shook his head, his expression darkening. "It doesn't matter. He's gone now. And if you're not careful, you'll end up the same way." Marion wanted to press him, to ask him what he meant, but there was no time. The sound of voices outside the cave grew louder, and she knew they had been found. "We need to move," Will said, his voice urgent. "Now." Marion nodded, gripping the arrow tightly as she followed Will deeper into the cave. The passage narrowed, the walls closing in around them until they were forced to crawl on their hands and knees. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Marion could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance, a steady, rhythmic patter that seemed to echo in her ears. They emerged into a larger chamber, the ceiling high above them, the walls lined with jagged rocks. A faint light filtered in from somewhere above, casting the room in an eerie glow. Marion could see the outline of a narrow ledge that led to a hidden exit, but the path was treacherous, the rocks slick with moisture. "We'll have to climb," Will said, his voice tense. "Can you do it?" Marion nodded, though her hands were trembling. She had never been fond of heights, but she had no choice. She tucked the arrow into her belt and began to climb, her fingers gripping the rough stone as she pulled herself up. Will followed close behind, his movements sure and steady. They were halfway up when the sound of voices reached them again, closer this time. Marion glanced down and saw the flicker of torches in the chamber below. The sheriff's men had found the cave. "Hurry!" Will urged, his voice tight with urgency. Marion climbed faster, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the arrow pressing against her side, its presence a constant reminder of what was at stake. She couldn't let them take it. She couldn't let them win. Finally, they reached the ledge and Marion pulled herself up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Will was right behind her, his face pale with exertion. They crouched low, peering over the edge as the sheriff's men entered the chamber below. "Spread out," one of the men ordered, his voice harsh. "She can't have gone far." Marion's grip tightened on the arrow, her mind racing. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit here and wait for them to find her. "Stay here," Will whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll distract them." Marion shook her head. "No, it's too dangerous." Will gave her a grim smile. "I've been in worse situations, trust me." Before Marion could argue, he was gone, slipping silently down the ledge and into the shadows below. She watched as he moved through the chamber, his movements fluid and precise. He was like a ghost, disappearing into the darkness and reappearing moments later, drawing the men away from the ledge. Marion's heart ached as she watched him, a strange mix of fear and admiration swirling in her chest. She didn't know why he was helping her, but she was grateful for it. As the men's voices faded into the distance, Marion took a deep breath and began to climb again, her movements slow and deliberate. She had to get out of here. She had to find a way to use the arrow to turn its power against the sheriff and his men. But as she climbed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the arrow was watching her, waiting for her to make a choice. And she knew deep down that whatever she decided, it would come with a price. The question was she willing to pay it? The forest was silent, but the air was thick with tension. Marion crouched in the shadows, her fingers gripping the arrow of Edric so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The sheriff's men were close, too close. She could hear their voices, their footsteps crunching on the forest floor, their torches casting long, flickering shadows that danced among the trees. Will Scarlet was gone. He had disappeared into the darkness, drawing the men away from her hiding place. Marion knew she should be grateful, but all she felt was a gnawing sense of guilt. She had dragged him into this, and now he was risking his life for her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The arrow of Edric pulsed faintly in her hand, its dark shaft gleaming in the dim light. It was more than just a weapon. It was a burden, a responsibility she wasn't sure she could bear. But she had no choice. The people needed her. They needed hope. Marion crept forward, her movements slow and deliberate. She had to find a way out of the forest, a way to rally the people and strike back against the sheriff. But the path ahead was fraught with danger, and she knew she couldn't do it alone. As she moved through the trees, she heard a faint rustling behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding, but there was no one there, just the wind, whispering, through the leaves. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The arrow of Edric seemed to grow heavier in her hand, its weight pressing down on her like a physical force. She could feel its power, its presence, as if it were alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a choice. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The answer came not in words, but in images that flashed through, her mind like fragments of a dream. She saw herself standing atop a hill, the arrow raised high, the people rallying behind her. She saw the sheriff's men falling back, their faces filled with fear, and then she saw herself, alone. The arrow, slipping from her grasp as the light faded from her eyes. Marion shuddered, her breath catching in her throat. The vision was clear, but its meaning was not. Was it a warning? A prophecy? Or simply her own fears manifesting in her mind? She didn't have time to ponder it. The sound of voices grew louder, and she knew she had to move. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the forest floor, the arrow clutched tightly in her hand. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around her, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Marion's breath came in ragged gasps, her legs burning with exertion. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Finally, she burst into a clearing, the moonlight casting a pale glow over the grass. She stopped, her chest heaving, and looked around. The clearing was empty, but she could feel the presence of something ancient, something powerful. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, its surface worn smooth by time. Marion approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The altar was covered in carvings, their meaning lost to the ages. But as she drew closer, she could see that they depicted the same figure she had seen at the shrine, a man with a bow, his arrow aimed at the sky. Marion's grip tightened on the arrow of Edric. She knew what she had to do. She placed the arrow on the altar, her hands trembling. The moment it touched the stone, a surge of energy shot through her, sharp and electric. She gasped, her vision blurring as the world around her seemed to shift and change. When her vision cleared, she was no longer in the clearing. She stood on a hill, the wind whipping through her hair, the arrow of Edric raised high in her hand. Below her, the people of Nottingham gathered, their faces filled with hope and determination. Marion's heart swelled with pride, but it was short-lived. The sheriff's men were advancing, their swords drawn, their faces filled with malice. She knew this was the moment of truth. She took a deep breath and raised the arrow high. "For freedom!" she shouted, her voice ringing out across the hill. The people roared in response, their voices rising in a deafening crescendo. Marion felt a surge of energy, a power unlike anything she had ever known. The arrow of Edric pulsed in her hand, its light growing brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. And then she released it. The arrow flew through the air, its path true, its light cutting through the darkness like a beacon. It struck the ground in front of the sheriff's men, and a shockwave of energy erupted, knocking them off their feet. The people surged forward, their spirits lifted by the arrow's power. Marion watched as they fought with renewed vigor, their determination unshakable. But as the battle raged on, Marion felt a strange sensation, a pulling, a draining, as if something inside her was being torn away. She looked down at her hands and saw that they were trembling, her skin pale and drawn. The arrow of Edric was taking its toll. Marion's vision blurred, and she stumbled, her legs giving out beneath her. She fell to her knees, the arrow slipping from her grasp. The world around her seemed to fade, the sounds of battle growing distant and muffled. "Marion!" Will's voice cut through the haze, sharp and urgent. She turned her head, her vision swimming, and saw him running toward her, his face filled with fear. "Will!" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He reached her side and dropped to his knees, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Marion, what's wrong? What happened?" She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her strength was fading, her body growing weaker with every passing moment. Will's eyes widened in realization. "The arrow, it's draining you, isn't it?" Marion nodded weakly, her vision darkening. She could feel the arrow's power, its presence, as if it were alive, feeding on her strength, her life. Will's grip tightened. "You have to let it go, Marion. You can't keep using it like this." "I have to," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "The people, they need me." "They need you alive," Will said, his voice fierce. "You can't help them if you're dead." Marion's vision blurred and she felt herself slipping away. The world around her seemed to fade, the sounds of battle growing distant and muffled. "Marion!" Will's voice was desperate now, his hands shaking her shoulders. "Stay with me," but it was no use. Marion's strength was gone, her body unable to fight any longer. She felt herself falling, the darkness closing in around her. And then nothing. When Marion opened her eyes, she was lying on the ground, the arrow of Edric clutched tightly in her hand. Will was kneeling beside her, his face pale with fear. "Marion," he said, his voice trembling, "you're alive." She blinked, her vision slowly clearing. The battle was over, the sheriff's men retreating into the forest. The people of Nottingham stood victorious, their faces filled with hope and determination. But Marion knew the cost of their victory. She could feel it in her bones, in the ache that spread through her body. The arrow of Edric had taken its toll, and she wasn't sure how much more she could give. Will helped. Her to her feet, his grip firm but gentle. "We need to get you out of here," he said, his voice low. "You're in no condition to fight." Marion nodded weakly, her legs trembling beneath her. She leaned on Will for support, her mind racing. The battle was won, but the war was far from over, and she knew that the arrow of Edric would demand more from her before it was done. As they made their way through the forest, Marion couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the arrow of Edric pulsing faintly in her hand, its presence a constant reminder of the price she would have to pay. The forest was quiet now, the echoes of battle fading into the distance. Marion leaned heavily on Will Scarlet as they made their way through the trees, her legs trembling with every step. The arrow of Edric still pulsed, faintly in her hand, its dark shaft gleaming in the moonlight, but its weight felt heavier than ever. It was no longer just a weapon or a symbol. It was a part of her, a burden she could not put down. Will's grip on her arm was firm, his face set in a grim mask. He hadn't said much since the battle, but Marion could see the worry in his eyes. He had risked everything to save her, and now he was risking even more by staying by her side. "We need to find shelter," Will said, his voice low. "You're in no condition to keep going." Marion nodded weakly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She knew he was right, but the thought of stopping filled her with dread. The sheriff's men were still out there, and the arrow's power had only bought them a temporary reprieve. The fight was far from over. They stumbled into a small clearing, the moonlight casting a pale glow over the grass. Will helped Marion sit against a tree, his hands gentle but firm. She leaned her head back, closing her eyes for a moment, but the images from the battle flashed behind her eyelids. The sheriff's men falling back, the people rallying behind her, the arrow's light cutting through the darkness. And then the pain, the draining, the feeling of something inside her being torn away. "Marion," Will said, his voice cutting through her thoughts, "you need to rest. You've done enough." She opened her eyes and looked at him, her vision blurry. "I haven't done enough," she whispered. "Not yet." Will sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're going to get yourself killed if you keep pushing like this." "Maybe," Marion said, her voice barely audible. "But if I don't, who will?" Will didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said enough. He was afraid, not for himself, but for her. And that fear cut deeper than any wound. Marion looked down at the arrow of Edric, its dark shaft gleaming faintly in the moonlight. She could feel its power, its presence, as if it were alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a choice. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The answer came not in words, but in a vision, a flash of light, a surge of energy, and then darkness. She saw herself standing atop a hill, the arrow raised high, the people rallying behind her. She saw the sheriff's men falling back, their faces filled with fear. And then she saw herself, alone, the arrow, slipping from her grasp as the light faded from her eyes. Marion shuddered, her breath catching in her throat. The vision was clear, but its meaning was not. Was it a warning, a prophecy, or simply her own fears manifesting in her mind? She didn't have time to ponder it. The sound of voices reached her ears, distant, but growing closer. The sheriffs. Men were searching the forest, and they wouldn't stop until they found her. "We need to move," Will said, his voice urgent. "Now." Marion nodded, her legs trembling as she tried to stand. Will helped her to her feet, his grip firm but gentle. She leaned on him for support, her mind racing. The battle was won, but the war was far from over, and she knew that the arrow of Edric would demand more from her before it was done. They moved through the forest, their steps slow and deliberate. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Marion could feel the weight of the arrow pressing down on her, its presence a constant reminder of the price she would have to pay. Finally, they reached the edge of the forest, the moonlight casting a pale glow over the fields beyond. Marion stopped, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could see the distant lights of Nottingham, the people celebrating their victory, but she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. "What now?" Will asked, his voice low. Marion looked down at the arrow of Edric, its dark shaft gleaming faintly in the moonlight. She could feel its power, its presence, as if it were alive, watching, her waiting for her to make a choice. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I can't keep going like this." Will's grip on her arm tightened. "You don't have to do this alone, Marion. Let me help you." Marion looked at him, her vision blurry. "You've already done so much, Will. I can't ask you to risk anymore." Will shook his head, his expression fierce. "You're not asking, I'm offering." Marion's heart ached at his words, but she knew he was right. She couldn't do this alone. The arrow of Edric demanded a sacrifice, but it didn't have to be hers alone. She took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, but we need a plan." Will's expression softened, and for a moment he looked almost relieved. "We'll figure it out together." Marion nodded, her grip tightening on the arrow. She could feel its power, its presence, as if it were alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a choice. And she knew deep down that whatever she decided, it would come with a price. The question was she willing to pay it? The days that followed were a blur of planning and preparation. Marion and Will worked tirelessly, rallying the people and preparing for the final confrontation with the sheriff. The arrow of Edric became a symbol of hope, its power inspiring the people to fight for their freedom. But Marion could feel the toll it was taking on her. The arrow's power was draining her, pulling at her strength, her life. She knew she couldn't keep going like this, but she also knew she couldn't stop. The final battle came sooner than expected. The sheriff's men attacked at dawn, their forces overwhelming the rebels. Marion stood at the front lines, the arrow of Edric raised high, its light cutting through the darkness. The battle was fierce, the air filled with the clash of swords and the cries of the wounded. Marion fought with everything she had, but she could feel her strength fading with every passing moment. Finally, she stood face to face with the sheriff, his eyes filled with malice. "You think you can win?" he sneered, his voice filled with contempt. "You're just a girl with a fancy arrow." Marion's grip tightened on the arrow, her vision blurring. "I'm more than that," she whispered. And then she released the arrow. It flew through the air, its path true, its light cutting through the darkness like a beacon. It struck the sheriff in the chest, and a shockwave of energy erupted, knocking him off his feet. The battle was over. Marion fell to her knees, the arrow slipping from her grasp. The world around her seemed to fade, the sounds of battle growing distant and muffled. "Marion!" Will's voice cut through the haze, sharp and urgent. She turned her head, her vision swimming, and saw him running toward her, his face filled with fear. "Will!" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He reached her side and dropped to his knees, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Marion, stay with me." But it was no use. Marion's strength was gone, her body unable to fight any longer. She felt herself falling, the darkness closing in around her, and then nothing. When Marion opened her eyes, she was lying in a bed, the sunlight streaming through the window. Will was sitting beside her, his face pale with exhaustion. "You're alive," he said, his voice trembling. Marion blinked, her vision slowly clearing. "What happened?" Will shook his head, his expression grim. "You saved us. The sheriff is gone and the people are free." Marion's heart ached at his words, but she knew it wasn't over. The arrow of Edric was still out there, its power, waiting for the next person to wield it. She looked down at her hands, her skin pale and drawn. The arrow's power had taken its toll, but she had no regrets. "It's over," Will said, his voice low. Marion shook her head. "No, it's just beginning." Will's grip on her hand tightened. "You've done enough, Marion. Let someone else take up the fight." Marion looked at him, her vision blurry. I can't. Not yet. Will's expression softened, and for a moment he looked almost relieved. Then I'll be here with you every step of the way. Marion nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew she wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. The years that followed were a time of change. The people of Nottingham began to rebuild, their spirits lifted by the victory over the sheriff. Marion and Will worked tirelessly, their bond growing stronger with every passing day. But the arrow of Edric was never far from Marion's thoughts. She could feel its presence, its power, as if it were alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a choice, and she knew deep down that whatever she decided, it would come with a price. The question was she willing to pay it? The final scene shows the arrow of Edric, glowing faintly in the hands of a young peasant boy, hinting that the spirit of rebellion will rise again in a new form. And Marion, now an old woman, watches from a distance, her heart filled with pride and sorrow. Legends are not born of fate, she whispers, her voice trembling, but of choice. And though the world may forget the names of those who fought, their whispers echo in the winds of change. And with that she turns and walks away, her steps slow but steady, the weight of the arrow's legacy resting on her shoulders. But she knows she is not alone, and that makes all the difference.